Hello everyone, welcome to sqadia.com. I'm Hina Khan and today the topic of our lecture is self-inflicted injuries. Now, the other names for these self-inflicted injuries can be the fabricated wounds. It can be referred to as the factitious wounds, and the self-harm wounds are also known as the self-inflicted injuries. Now, the self-inflicted injuries are basically the injuries that a person caused to himself, but that is not a part. He's not a part of the psychological problems. Instead, he wants some benefit out of these self-inflicted wounds. So all of these injuries basically come under the heading of the self-inflicted injury or the fabricated or the factitious wound. Even a syndrome which is known as the Munchausen syndrome basically belongs to these self-inflicted injuries or the self-infliction disease phenomena in which a person basically commutes as if he is in a diseased state, although he is not showing any pathological or any laboratory findings which are basically pointing out towards his or her disease. So all of these self-inflictions come under the heading of the self-inflicted injuries. We'll be dealing with them in this lecture. In the first section, basically, we'll be dealing with the classification mainly. How do we classify these self-inflicted wounds? Now, these self-inflicted wounds can be of a suicidal intent and they can be of a non-suicidal intent. Now, the suicidal, as I've already emphasized on the fact that the person is not suffering from any psychological phenomena when we are dealing with these self-inflicted or with these factitious or fabricated wounds. Instead, he is basically making up all of these factitious wounds, although the wounds are real in nature, but they are factitious in a sense that they are made by the person himself or herself, just to charge for some claim, or it can be for some legal phenomena even. So all of these basically are categorized over here. How do we categorize them? They can be of an intensity that a suicide can be related to them, and they can be of a non-suicidal intention as well. So they are basically categorized in the first section. We'll be discussing them in detail over here. Then we have the suicidal injuries. The suicidal injuries can again, there are different phenomena that a person can refer to whenever he's committing a suicide. It can be burns, it can be firearm injuries, it can be hanging or fall from heights, it can be any poisonous materials. So all of these basically are categorized over here, and we are going to discuss them in detail in this first section. Now, moving on to the second section that basically specifically deals with the suicidal injuries. And here we'll be dealing with the firearm wounds, all the phenomena in which a combustion phenomena occurs that basically comes under this heading of the firearm wounds. Then we'll be moving on to the submersion phenomena. Submersion, in other words, is basically the drowning phenomena in which the person can basically self-inflict himself towards drowning. And this self-inflicted drowning can sometimes be pointed out whenever we are whenever we are ruling out any investigations at any crime scene, and we usually go through them, and here we have to basically make a borderline between the suicidal and the non-suicidal injuries. Then we'll be moving on in the next section towards burning and asphyxia. Asphyxia can again be of masochistic asphyxia, which is basically the sexual form of the asphyxia. That basically comes under this heading of the suicidal asphyxia and is very important and commonly seen, especially in the drug addicts. And moving on, we'll be dealing with the jumping from the height. So jumping from the height can be another phenomena which is seen in the suicidal injuries, in the suicidal intentions. And then in the third section, basically, we'll be dealing with the suicidal knife wounds. So knife wounds, as I have already referred to as, these sharp weapons can be categorized as the single-edged and the double-edged weapons, and they are discussed in detail in this section. We'll be specifically dealing with the cutthroat injuries. So the cutthroats that are suicidal in intention, they are discussed over here in the third section. And then we'll be moving on towards the wrist cuts. So wrist cuts is a very common phenomena whenever we are managing any OPD or any medical legal aspects of any cases. Sometimes we come across these wrist cuts, and they're also referred to as the hesitational or the suicidal intention cuts. Whenever a person performs any suicide or any major injury to himself, before that he basically performs these suicidal hesitational cuts over his wrist just to try on himself. And these cuts are basically very important, and they're pointing towards the suicidal tendency of any person at a psychological level. So they have to be pointed out at this level of any crime scene investigation. And then injuries to the chest, they are also again very important. Whenever they're not really common in this sense. They're not really common in this sense because the injuries to the chest at this level are not usually seen in all of these cases. Then moving on to the self-harm injuries. Now, the self-harm injuries are basically the self-inflicted injuries other than the suicide. So, other than the suicide, sometimes a person may or may not have an intention of the suicide, but still he may harm himself in all the other senses. Even the drug addiction can come under this heading of the self-harm. Then moving on towards the characteristic features of the self-harm, what kind of a psychological trait a person will be having whenever he is having the self-harm is very important. As I've already discussed, the Munchausen syndrome. Now, Munchausen syndrome, as we have already dealt with, it's basically a particular kind of syndrome in which the person basically feels as if he has a disease, but it's all a dramatization of the situation, and it's basically the laboratory findings are not pointing out towards any type of disease, and the person is hale and healthy at that point, but still he is constantly dramatizing as if he is having some sort of a disease. And this basically comes under the heading of the self-harm injuries. So I hope you want to learn more about these self-inflicted injuries, how a person can harm himself. So do watch the other sections to this lecture. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.